we use that tool to register and also to look for employees in our sector. So without wasting time, I'm handing over to Renee to take us to the platform. It's going to be a practical demo. Encourage everyone who's working in recruitment, who normally looks for agents or look for staff, just to, if you can just please take cognizance of what you're sharing and please ask any questions that you might have. Over to you, Renee.
Thanks, Amkelo. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. And while I'm doing that, maybe just some quick context for those of you that don't know. Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator is a public-private partnership that was established in 2011 to build a solution for youth employment in South Africa. And so we're a not-for-profit social enterprise, and we, of course, are not able to do this work alone. And so we rely heavily on our on support from our partners, which is in the government space, private sector, and civil society to help catalyze economic growth and provide visibility of these jobs for young people. And of course, we do this through the platform called SAYouth, which was established in 2020 and was officially announced during President Cyril Ramaphosa's speech, and really is a comprehensive response to the challenge of youth unemployment in South Africa. So we've got many partners, as I mentioned, in the government space, private sector and civil society working together on a range of projects and programs aimed at tackling youth unemployment. And so these partners are using SAYouth to make visible these opportunities and solutions to young people. And really, the call today is really just to make use of this platform. We, as Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator, we manage the platform on behalf of the Presidency's office, and it is a free service to work seekers and employers. And so I'm going to carry on with just a demo of what this platform looks like. Some of you may have seen it, but just as a recap, I'm going to go through the registration process on SAYouth, as well as how to make visible these opportunities. So,
as you can see there, it was where Wi-Fi Corporation used to be, and
okay.
They're on the top level. So you know where this is. If you
sorry, Renee, can we please all mute our mics, please? We don't want to hear who's on the N1 and which bodyguards are doing what to who. Please, can you all mute our mics? Sorry about that, Renee. Please go ahead.
No worries. We'll share some links as well after the session. But essentially, the link to join SAYouth, when you click on it, this is the screen that you'll see. You'll, of course, click Join the Partner Network. And of course, the point of contact for your organization that's going to be setting up the profile needs to provide their information. So as in this example, name, surname, business email address, and obviously create a password, read and agree to the terms and conditions. And it's a very simple 2-pager that we are able to share up front as well. You create your profile and then, of course, need to indicate what it is that you're going to be doing on the partner network. There's a range of things, but more often than not, it's finding work seekers for your opportunity. And of course, just indicating, what sector you're from. And again, a range of options that you are able to choose from. But for this particular demo, I'm just going to use the private sector as an example. And then complete the registration of your account. Again, as in this example, your business name, your registration number, the industry you're in, which is really important, where your organization is based. There is another piece that's not part of this demo, but that's, if you belong to any industry body, is to indicate that. So if you are a member of BPESA and you're registering on the profile, of course, just indicate that on the network as well. And then you create your account, and then you'll get an email to your inbox that looks something like this. You'll need to verify. You'll need to verify your email address. And our team will then get a notification to say that Partner X has registered a profile. They'll do their, due diligence, QA the particular account. And once it's verified, you'll get a notification to say that you're able to log into your account. And then, of course, you can navigate the platform, load opportunities, make it visible to young people. And you are able to access reporting on the front end, where you're able to track, how many jobs you've made available, how many young people have applied, how many you've placed into roles, if you want to do a trend analysis on your end and just really track it. So that's what you're able to do. But for the purposes of this demo today, I'm going to show you how to create opportunities or jobs as we know it. And so how you do that is on this navigation pane on the left-hand side here, you'll see opportunities, work seekers, organization, and reports. And so, of course, under opportunities is where you'll go to create a new job card. Under organization, whomever the point of contact is able to add additional users. So if you have a recruitment team that you're wanting to add that's going to navigate this platform, you're absolutely able to add them all as users, and they can then just, load these jobs. So essentially, you'll click add a new opportunity, and you can indicate if it's a paid position, and this obviously means that a young person will receive a salary for work done, or an unpaid grow your skills opportunity, which is essentially a learning opportunity. So if you have a training program where the young person will not be getting a salary, but perhaps a certificate at the end of a particular skilling or training program, you're absolutely able to do that. We do have an additional section that's just been added on the live platform, and that's called the make your own money opportunity. So jobs like Avon, or where young people are able to sort of start a side hustle and earn money. We've got those options available as well. But again, for this demo, we'll go through a paid position, and so that's what you'll indicate. And the opportunity holder details is the organization's profile under which you're working, and this will be automatically populated. In this example, it's multi-choice. If you are, or if there is a particular sponsor that's funding your project or your recruitment drive, you're able to include it under this little block here under sponsoring partner. Or if you are affiliated to YES, otherwise known as Youth Employment Services, you're able to indicate that there as well. And it's really important to do that, especially when we are drawing reports and we're wanting to track information. The more info you input here, the better our reporting will be. And then it's pretty stock standard, the opportunity title, in this example, the finance intern, which industry it is in, and then just a short opportunity description. So like a little blurb about the organization, the role, the responsibility of the young person in that particular role, using a language that is descriptive and easy to understand. We know young people don't like to read a lot, so we need to make it as enticing as possible. And then just indicating the contract type. So if it's fixed term or permanent part-time, you'd need to indicate how long that contract is for. And of course, if it's full-time, you wouldn't need to do that. How many vacancies are available, as well as when you'd like the opportunity to close. So depending on the complexity of the role, or just how many young people you're looking for will determine how long you're going to keep the opportunity open for. And of course, you can monitor those applications and always extend it if you need to do so. Very importantly, the SAYouth platform uses algorithms to match young people to jobs. And one of the data points that we use is the geographical location of a young person in relation to where the job is. And so you absolutely need to include the address of that location, of that job location. And so you'll click add a new address. You'll include the address, and then of course, just a contact name for that address. And this is just for back-end information, so nobody sees that on the front end. You'll add that address to your list. And so now the recommendation engine knows to match young people as closely as possible to Randburg. And we use about a 50-kilometer radius. And for rural areas, it's obviously that radius is extended. Next is salary and benefits for the position. There is an option to not specify a salary. We always encourage our employer partners to specify a salary because, we've seen an uptake in applications for certain jobs where employers have indicated a salary versus not. It's important to be transparent, and young people, they want to know what they're going to be earning. But again, the option is there for you to choose. And then, of course, if you do indicate that how often the salary will be paid, and the amount, if there are any additional benefits like pension aid, pension fund, medical aid, transport allowance, you're able to indicate that as well. Otherwise, just leave it blank. The next piece is just indicating what the requirements are needed in a young person for this opportunity. So things like educational qualifications, computer literacy, whether or not they need to have a driver's license, whatever the requirements are is what you'll include here. And then sort of just deep diving into it. So, do they need to have matric? What languages do they need to be able to speak? are young people that has a disability, can they apply for this job? If yes, what kind of disabilities do they need to have that the job and the organization is able to accommodate? Then, of course, gender, race, and age. Our age criteria is between 18 and 34. However, this is an inclusive platform, so anybody is able to register and apply for jobs. The algorithm will just work in such a way as per what the job requirements are. And then the next piece is, you're able to ask questions as part of the application process. And this is really cool functionality for when you're wanting to do your shortlisting. It really works on streamlining it. And so we've got a bank of preset questions that you're able to go through. If it's not relevant to your role, absolutely don't ask it. Those are questions like just trying to understand and get to know the young person a little better. So we know that most young people in communities are not working. So what are they doing with their time? Do they volunteer at community-based organizations? What kind of organizations are they volunteering at? And this really gives you a sense of the young person. It also, highlights some skills that they may have gained by doing this voluntary work. But the other really cool functionality is custom questions. And so you're able to ask this as part of your process. And what's cool about it is that you're able to choose how you'd like the work seeker to answer questions. And so we've got the short text answer option. We've got paragraph text, which is longer. We've got the multiple choice drop down and yes, no. I generally encourage partners to utilize the multiple choice drop down or yes, no options. It just really streamlines the process. Young people, given the opportunity, like to type a whole lot of stuff, if you give them the option. Of course, if it's needed, absolutely do that. But as an example, if you're wanting to understand, what kind of disability a young person has, they don't often, or they don't always update it on their profile. So if you're wanting to, just sort of dig deep, you may want to ask, do you have a physical disability? Yes or no? Or ask a question and you can provide a list of possible responses that they're able to choose from. So when you're needing to shortlist and filter, you'd know exactly what you're looking for, and it just really makes it easier. So that's really cool. And so you can obviously just add that. And then, of course, as part of the application process, when they apply, they've got to answer these questions. We've also got the voice note piece, which in this industry is really critical, like we know. And so you're able to listen to the spoken English ability of a work seeker to determine whether or not they're suitable, for a particular role. And so you can ask any question and they'll need to respond by recording a voice note in response to that question. And then you're also able to set up an interview on the platform. Again, if this is not something that you want to do, you don't have to, you can just say no. But if you do say yes, you'll need to indicate if it's going to be a face-to-face interview or online. If it's face-to-face, again, you'd need to provide the location for that interview if it's any different to the place of work. If it's online, you'd need to provide a meeting URL for either Teams, Zoom, Google Meets, whatever it is. And again, if this is something you're going to be doing, you may want to ask a custom question around this. So something along the lines of, this interview will be conducted virtually. Do you have access to Teams on your phone or device that has Teams that you can access for this interview? It gives you a good indication of who's likely going to be able to attend a online interview. And then, of course, just set up your interview time slots. And then the last piece is really just a preview of what that job card looks like. And you can make sure, just read through it, make sure that you've included everything, that it looks good. And then when you click create opportunity, the status is open and it goes live on the Mobi platform immediately, and young people has visibility of this job. So the demo is long, but this really should take you all of 5 minutes if you've got all of your information. So that's essentially how you create the job card. And then the next piece is really just your applicant list and what that looks like. So I just want to give you a view of that. So this is what it looks like. So, once young people apply to your job, you'll be able to see a list of who's applied at a very quick view, who meets all of your criteria, how far away from the opportunity they stay. If you've requested a voice note, here's where you can listen to it. And then we've got this favorites functionality, which you can use as part of your shortlisting. So if you highlight any of these hearts, they'll move over to the marked as favorites bar, and you can sort of work from here, especially if you get a lot of applications. We've also got the pending, so the outcome. So very importantly, once you completed your shortlisting or your recruitment process as such, and you've selected people, you absolutely need to come back onto this platform to indicate who you've hired. And that piece of work is being streamlined at the moment to make it easier for you as partners to come back and indicate those hires. But just as a quick view, if you click on see more, you're able to see the responses to the custom questions. And so here you can start to see, if it's a short text answer sort of option, you're going to have to sort of sift through what they're trying to say. You can look at the applicant profile as a quick view. So you'll see personal details, the contact details, education, and then of course the placement outcome, which I've chatted about. This open filter button here is where you can apply additional filters. So maybe you only want to see work seekers that have met all your criteria, that lives within a 40-kilometer radius, that it said, yes, I love sales to a custom question. So you can do that as well. You can also select all and download the applicant list. It'll be exported into Excel, and there you'll see all of the additional data points of the person's profile as and when they registered on the Mobi platform. The next piece is where you can engage with work seekers on the platform by inviting them to interviews, sending them an SMS message. So essentially, if you have indicated interview time slots on your job card, you're then able to send an interview message. And essentially what that looks like, so here you can see, the hearts that have been highlighted and moved over to the marked as favorites bar. So you sort of highlight or click on the box next to the young person's name. You click send invite. This is an example of what that SMS will look like. It always starts with hashtag SAYouth. The work seeker will get an SMS with the link that they need to click on, and they can opt in or opt out of that interview, and you'll be able to see that on the applicant list as well. You can also send an SMS. So maybe you haven't set up an interview slot, but you just want to send an SMS around it. Again, select that person, click on send SMS, and this is a free text section where you're able to type, a message to a young person with a maximum of 303 characters. And you can say, don't forget to bring your certificate, or this is the details of your interview, etc. And then the last piece is, once you've gone through everything, coming back here, indicate the hires by, again, selecting the person, clicking update outcome, and indicating the hiring outcome. So either hired or not hired, and then just one or two additional data points. I think it's salary and start date that you'd need to complete, update, save, and the pending status changes to hired. So that's essentially the end-to-end process on the platform, but I'm open to any questions. There's a whole lot more, but I don't think we have a lot of time for it, but yeah, open to questions. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you very much, Renee, just for that breakdown. And also I appreciate how you went granular, showing examples even on tracking applicants. I did ask in the chat, is there anyone who has a question for Renee on the SAYouth platform? Any questions? You can just unmute and ask the question.
I see one question from Claiborne, just around. Yeah. So, I mean, at the moment, we don't have any functionality for that yet. Good question. I know for sure we don't. Happy to chat to our product and dev team around that and what their thinking is about it, but we don't have any functionality to accommodate that at this time.
Very good question, Claiborne. Thanks, Renee. Any other questions, colleagues?
Just to quickly add, hi, Samkelo. Thanks, Renee, for the awesome presentation. Very, very valuable. Just around that functionality, and the biggest reason I'm asking is because our core focus is obviously bringing into the sector dev-to-dev call center services, which obviously allows us to address that specific market. And so it is quite new. It is really new to the sector, and we obviously understand that there is certain developments that needs to take place in that regard. My question then would be would you be willing to just reach out to us in that regard so that we can kind of, speak around it and how we can incorporate to find a solution, because we are heading onto this platform ourselves as well. So, and we would like to obviously do a lot of the recruitment, etc., via the platform for these deaf agents. So Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We can put you in touch with our product team, but we'll reach out to you.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Rene. Very good question there. Any other questions before we move over to salary survey? I did not say salary increase for all of us in the group. I said salary survey. Rene, a very good presentation, very practical. Rene, if you don't mind just putting your email address in the chat box, because I know some people might want to email you to ask you questions offline. And thank you, Rene. The next part of our session today, just for 5 minutes, Tracy Freeman is going to share with us the salary survey that is taking place in this sector. Over to you, Tracy.
Tracy, we're not hearing you.
Tracy, we can't hear you. If you are speaking, I learned a diplomatic way to say you are mute. If you are speaking, we cannot hear you. Okay, seems like we're struggling to get hold of Tracy. I'm going to move on to the next one that we're going to do in this session. Let me just admit Kathy from WebHelp. Welcome, Kathy, and thank you very much for your presence. We started with the SAYouth platform, and it was a good feedback and practical demo. The next presenter or facilitator is going to be Llewellyn from Sebano. He's touching on that sensitive yet critical issue of organizational culture, which speaks to how does it feel like to work here. And I know many of you are familiar with the quote that culture will eat your strategy for breakfast. One person said, actually, culture will eat everything. So Lou will share to us briefly about culture. What is it that they do? And also, how can we influence culture? But also, he will indicate his details again. Llewellyn from Sebano, thank you so much for joining us. And over to you, sir.
Thank you, Samkelo. Let me just, hopefully you're all seeing that. And yes, please, as we go, feel free to put your questions in the chat box. If I can't see it, I'm sure Samkelo or someone will raise it. Otherwise, I'll make sure I can see them at the end of this short presentation. So a critical question, I think all people are, and I see question is spelled really well there, are asking is, given the new operating reality, the critical question is, how do you build an organization that can survive and thrive in an uncertain world? And the new operating kind of reality includes things like hybrid workplaces. And I think, if anything, we're seeing that culture, it was one thing if you were in the office all the time, it's another thing if you were only a virtually based company. But hybrid brings a whole lot of new challenges in terms of, so what does our culture look like? What's important to us? How should it impact our core values? And how do we drive culture in our business? In Sebano, we've had this formula that, in fact, someone gifted to us when we started our business 25 years ago. And it really has had meaning for us. And it says, what creates value? What creates value in an organization? And clearly, capabilities are important. Do your people have the right skills, the right experience, the right knowledge? But then there are these two multipliers that I believe are critical. The one is affinity, which speaks to the sense of belonging to an organization, sharing its aims and its ethos, and that speaks strongly to culture. And the other one is alignment. Do people know, do you have the right strategy in place? Do people know what you're trying to achieve and how they contribute to that? And is there purpose and meaning in their roles? And it's specifically a multiplier because you cannot be low in any one of these without impacting the total result. So if any one of these is close to zero, the answer is also going to be close to zero. And then Jim Ware wrote a book where he was looking actually at asset managers, and he came up with 3 critical elements in leadership. Competence, which relates quite strongly to the capability. Caring, which speaks about the environment, the culture. And that's not just a warm hug, hugging, warm, fuzzy kind of world. It's how do we actually meet each other and see each other and care for each other in the workplace? And then congruence. Do we know what we're marching to and what we're trying to achieve? And then, of course, Nelson Mandela himself said a good head and a good heart are always a formidable combination. So the head stuff, I find businesses are really good at, the strategy, the skill stuff. But when it's the heart stuff, the culture and the purpose and the meaning, it isn't always that easy to get right. So how do culture and brand relate to each other? So the culture is the employee perspective, then brand is really the stakeholder perspective. And in fact, I believe it's two sides of one coin. The one side is culture, the other side is brand. And in fact, if anything, culture is your brand. And if you want to test that for yourself, just think of any retail outlet that you may go to, and some of them, when the culture is healthy and strong, and others you get the sense culture might not be what it should be. So your people are going to see that, your suppliers, your customers, your clients are going to see what your culture is as you journey with them or try to journey with them. There's a very interesting survey Deloitte did some time back now, and still rings true. I was reading a book last week, a current book on culture, and he came up with very similar statistics where he said, a lot of executives will tell you that culture is important, some 92%. 86% of them said, that 92% redesign is important, which is an interesting one. Sorry, I went ahead of myself there. It's an interesting one because so many organizations believe that structural redesign is going to help them achieve their strategic aims. However, often it's a matter of just reorganizing deck chairs on the Titanic. If you're not addressing culture, you've got a big issue in terms of thinking that redesign might help your business function better. Now, I'm not saying you don't need to redesign. I'm saying redesign and strategy is as important as the culture that you're instilling in the business. So 86% of executives believe it's important. 28% think they have the right, 28% understand or say they're trying to understand what's required. Sorry, everybody's covering my notes here. And 12% actually say they believe they're driving the right culture. So that's a very scary statistic. And I find most CEOs, if I speak to them, they'll tell you culture is important. And then you ask them, well, how are you doing? Do you think you're on the right track? Are things working for you? And it becomes very wishy-washy in terms of how they feel about that and how they respond to it. So I believe it's important to measure culture, and it is possible. There are many tools and frameworks out there that one can use these days. And it's not about just ticking a tick box to say, okay, we've done our culture survey, or we've had a dipstick test look at our culture. It's also about understanding, so what are the things we need to be speaking about? What are the elephants in the room around organizational culture or team cohesion that we're not addressing? How are our strategies impacting? So you need to measure this on a continual basis to say, well, are we shifting the dial in the direction we're wanting to or not? You want to know what to focus on. Culture and organizational culture, there are many behaviors that are evident in an organization. Which are the ones that you really want to drive and support, and how do you go about that? And then you're wanting to understand not only what people are experiencing now, but also what are people calling you to? What do people believe are those key aspirational values that the organization should live for you to be able to reach your full potential? So measuring it can really help a lot. You've heard this definition, I'm sure, many times, the one down the bottom there, culture represents the way things are done around here. I'd like to also suggest, though, that culture is a reflection of the values, beliefs, and behaviors of past and present leaders. And all of you in organizations will know, as leadership changes, the culture tends to shift. And some of the legacy stuff can last for a long time, be that positive or negative, or detracting from what you're trying to achieve. And so this is a really important point, because leaders not only set the tone for culture, but I believe they also provide the lid or the cap on what you can achieve from an organizational culture perspective. So really important when you're looking at culture to take leaders with you on a journey. And I always say, when organizations want to start a culture journey, give me half an hour with the CEO first, because I want to ensure that the request for this journey is real and it's not just a tick box exercise. Because 9 times out of 10, it's going to mean the leaders themselves need to make certain shifts if they really want to change the culture. I came across this definition, which really resonated with me. Culture is how employees' hearts and stomachs feel about Monday morning on Sunday night. And I think that's a great litmus test. And I don't know, can't see you on the screens, but I'm sure many of you have that feeling of, I can't wait to get up on Monday. And some of you are like, It's the last thing you feel like on a Monday morning to go to work. So one of the frameworks that we've developed in Sabano that has really proved helpful with organizations and leaders is what we call our progressive success through culture shift framework or model. And many of you may have read the book Good to Great, and it sounds good to great. However, the spectrum is far broader, and organizations can find themselves in a toxic space, rigid, good, great, or even endearing. And clearly, an organizational culture isn't in any one of these aspects. There's a distribution. And in fact, culture can vary, as you know, between departments. Those of you in high-rise buildings, the fourth floor and the third floor, you can sense there's a different culture when you walk into that space. And so this framework helps organizations create the opportunity for the dialogue or the conversation around what is happening in their space and what they believe needs to shift. And to just expound on this model a little bit, so what does the toxic world look like? Well, that is unsafe. Okay, that is an abusive type of environment, not a very pleasant place to work in at all. It's often disrespectful. These are the kind of values or behaviors that might show up in a toxic space. Power, so it's about power over, it feels quite oppressive. There may be shaming, there may be fear, but ultimately it's a culture that's unsustainable because the cost, and I'll explain that to you in a minute, how you can estimate that cost to just survive in the toxic culture takes a lot of energy from what you're meant to be doing in the business to achieve your strategic requirements. The rigid culture is a cautious one, and it often comes from a good intention or a good place. So leaders and organizations put rules in place, policies in place to help define how we should operate as an organization or how we should respond or react to certain stimuli or what may be happening. And that's helpful, but it can become very bureaucratic over time. So, the 3-step plan becomes the 5-step, the 10-step, and eventually you've got 25 steps, and no one really knows where they came from or why they're still there. But you want to comply, so compliance is really crucial, and people tick the steps. So you're trying to mitigate risk and manage outcome, which is healthy, but too much of that can result in a lot of inflexibility. And I always say, when those strong winds of change blow, rigidity is brittle and it breaks, and it's not going to serve your organization if you're predominantly sitting in a cautious space. The good space in this framework of ours is the kind of me-centric space. So it's optimistic. It's about growing my skill, being able to deliver, intelligent, we've got profit, but often it can be quite a short-term focused thing, quite a driven, kind of often an A-type personality, if you want to think of the organization like that. And it can be quite individualistic and often competitive. And I know I've put competitive in the good space. My real sense is when you see competitive, it's often win-lose. It's seldom win-win. And so maybe competitive belongs in a toxic space most of the time. But good cultures deliver, and the organization can be doing quite well, and the team can be functioning quite well. I think we all would prefer the great space, though, which is the more integrated space. If good is me-centric, then great is we-centric. So it's about how do we operate as a team? How do we collaborate? It's a far more innovative space and involved. People want to hear others. They want people to contribute. And so it's way more empowering, far more sustainable, and it brings some more personal growth and shared success. I think what's important in this space to get into the great space is EQ, and having the emotional intelligence to understand how we work as a team, how we interact, how do we do things better together is critical in that space if you want to really embrace the we-centric great culture. And then lastly is what I would like to call the endearing or the inspired space. Now it's not just about emotional intelligence, it's also SQ or spiritual quotient. In other words, purpose and meaning. Do I understand how my role contributes to what's important to me? Can I see that alignment, and can I see how it contributes to the greater good of the organization or society or whatever I might be serving as part of my role? It's often a lot more decentralized, so teams have a lot more empowerment, a lot more freedom and flexibility in terms of how they respond and react. And from a leadership perspective, what's important here, it really requires servant leadership and understanding what servant leadership looks like and what it means in the context of the organization. So what I find fascinating, and you can look at this model in many different ways, this just says in these different cultures, how do leaders see themselves? So in the toxic space, often leaders think they're on top of their game. You know, they really know where they're going. They don't really need anybody to tell them much, and they drive hard. But actually, that often leads to a toxic type environment. In the rigid world, there are all these rules in place, and the leaders might see themselves as kind and efficient. You know, everyone's got their policies. They know what they're meant to be doing. I'm not aggressive or I don't have power over, but they must just comply, meet all the rules, and we will be efficient and do what we need to do. The good space is way more supportive and involved. This is where leaders really start taking an interest in how the individual is growing, how they're contributing, what kind of obstacles can they remove for them to actually contribute more. The great space is where people come to work inspired. That is the space I'm sure many of us want to be in terms of working for leaders that really inspire us. And then the enduring space is where the leader really sees themselves as servants to the business or stewards. They understand that they're there for a time. They're there to deliver on certain strategic objectives, not at the expense of people, but with their people, and to build a healthy organizational culture. But you look at the flip side of, so how does the employee experience these kind of leaders? And it's quite amusing if you look at some of that, because the leader might think in the toxic space they're on top of their game, but the employee experiences that they're very critical and overbearing. They may think they're kind and efficient in the cautious space, but from the employee's perspective, they're pretty uninvolved, distant, and probably superfluous, because there's so many rules to follow. Who needs leaders' kind of inspiration anyway? In good, it's far more about team players, the way they experience the leader, very supportive and involved in the great culture, and endearing in the inspirational and visionary type culture. So I'm sure as I put this picture up, your mind was already going to, so where are we? You know, what's happening in my department, or what's happening in my business? And this framework can form a great discussion. If the culture is not too toxic or rigid, putting this kind of picture up and talking through it and what it means for you can really help your team. However, if the culture is toxic or rigid, one has to be a lot more careful around how you actually broach the subject and how it is actually facilitated. A colleague of mine always said, you know, if you're living in a very toxic culture, be careful if you try to drain the swamp, because the crocodile likes the swamp. So all of you will know what I'm meaning if you've had toxic leaders and you've had that experience. So how do we then shift culture, depending on where we may be on the spectrum? And if the toxic culture is typically, you know, the don't talk, don't trust, don't feel, you kind of fly below the turret, because as soon as you stick your head up, someone might take a pot shot at you. So what needs to happen? And often you almost need to bring in some rules of the game to help protect some of those who have been hurt through this toxic processes. So it's about calling people to responsibility. Having appropriate core values and behaviors in place can be really helpful, because you can start actually bringing into the business, so how do we show up to show that we're living our values, whatever they may be. You might have a value of care or respect or trust. What does that look like? How does it show up in our team context? And so one can then surface the unsafe behavior, set appropriate boundaries, which is where the rules may need to come in, and encourage people to cease that abusive behavior. So is there a question there? Okay. The rigid culture, on the other hand, is rules-driven. So it's a lot about control and compliance, about ticking the boxes, making sure we've done what we had to do for the 25 points, whatever it might be. And there it's about calling people or allowing people actually to examine the rules. So it's about creating that encouraging space where people can actually question, why are these rules in place, and why are these steps in place? And leaders then have to have the ability to give the why. And part of that is educational and learning and growth for the people as well, to understand what may be really necessary, as opposed to just ticking boxes. And it might even help you reduce some of the bureaucracy in the system. So it's this whole question about, is it true? Is it really necessary to do this particular step? What's interesting is often in rigid cultures, I find organizations say to me, what's best practice? And they want to move towards what they perceive to be best practice in a certain area, be it talent management or learning or whatever it might be. You're going to see in a moment, I'm going to query that best practice because I think it can be really dangerous. And the reason I say that is because best practice is actually context relevant. So if you want to have Amazon's culture, but you're not an Amazon type business, it could be really dangerous. So one needs to understand the context and move away from best practice to, I think, what appropriate practice would be. So the good culture, skilled, best practice is now happening. You know, people are doing it. They're productive. They're competitive. But here the invitation is to examine the bigger picture and to help people expand context, to say it's not just about you. It's not just about your growth. It's also about the team or the organization or what we're trying to achieve. And this is kind of the move towards more appropriate practice. So what's best fit for the whole? What's best fit for our organization or our department? And how should we be changing? The great culture, I mean, people already in that space are appreciative, they're involved, they have shared values, shared vision. And there, I guess, it's more about the invitation to serve the greater good. So it's not just your department or our organization, it's also about what are we doing in society? What are we doing maybe in your suppliers or in your customers, etc., in terms of serving the community to serve the greater good. And that's what really helps bring the passion and the meaning and the inspiration. And then lastly, if you're already in that space where you're endearing and you have stakeholder stewardship and servant leadership, it's really about staying in there. And the important thing about culture is I find the gravity naturally heads towards that red, the orange and the red. So if your leaders are not spending a significant amount of their leadership time understanding the culture, building the appropriate culture, helping correct culture when things are going wrong, the chances are the gravity is going to take you downhill and culture will just slowly start slipping to a place where you probably don't want it and it's not ideal for your organization. So here's a picture. So I said it's always a distribution. This is a sad picture. Okay, 70% of the cultures people believe are sitting in the kind of toxic and rigid space. 30% toxic, 40% rigid. So this one might be extreme, but having 15% toxic or 20 to 30% rigid is not is pretty normal. Let me put it that way in terms of the surveys we've been running. And this is what it looks like. So if you've got 30% toxic, imagine 100 people on the right-hand side. The red people represent the toxic. They're almost unproductive. It's really a wasted resource, you know, and the way you're experiencing that in your organization is you second guess what might happen in the meeting and you kind of scenario play in your mind because you cannot go there and bring your whole self into that meeting because you may upset someone or you might get a response that's not going to be helpful. So that has a direct cost to the business. The rigid stuff is stuff that holds you back. So you might believe you obviously need steps, processes, and things, how things should be done. But again, if people understand the why, they will buy into that. If it's just a tick box, it's actually holding you back. And the kind of thing I often do is I say to an executive team, hey, if you're sitting in this horrible situation, let's say the 70% in toxic and rigid, what percentage of your salary and wages bill do you believe you are wasting either through a wasted resource or it's holding you back? And you go around the table and they're probably with 70%, they're going to come up with something like a 35 to 50% is probably wasted. Now it becomes a big number. And then the follow-up question to that is, and what is the opportunity cost you're missing out on because people are spending time on the wrong things? And they might add another 15 or 20%. So before you know it, if this was the reality, you've got like 60% of your salary bill or 70% of your salary bill you're saying actually is not helping us be productive or it's not helping us meet those opportunities we need to meet. And the more you have in the toxic and rigid space, the less you will have in the innovation, new ideas, new opportunities, growing your business. So really important to understand what's sitting down there and how to deal with it. So that's kind of the framework I wanted to speak through. I hope it's helpful. I'm happy to make this presentation available should you want to use that framework in some way. But I'd love to hear if there are any questions around culture, organizational culture, team cohesion, anything in that space that we can try and help you with.
Thanks, Llewellyn. I've got a question from Claiborne. What is the difference between culture and the company's vision? Is there a distinct difference between organizational culture and the vision of the company? Your thoughts, sir?
So I think a company needs actually three things. You need a vision, which is your why. You need a mission, which is your what. And you need your core values, or how you're going to live out delivering on your mission and hopefully achieving your vision in terms of what you want to do. And vision for me is something that creates inspiration. You know, if you told me your vision for your business is to be the second biggest window seller in South Africa, I'll say, well, like, that's meaningless to me as an employee. What would inspire me in that vision? You know, to provide effective windows that keep out the cold and help people live better. I don't know, whatever it might be. But you need to get something that's really inspirational and is a rally call for your people.
Okay, no, excellent. Thank you very much. Any other questions from the people on the call? You can just unmute your mic and just go ahead. Any other questions for Llewellyn? By the way, well done, Renee and Llewellyn. The numbers of people logged on this call have just kept consistently. They've not gone down dramatically. So people are still logged in, they are listening. I have no evidence of what they are doing while they are logged on. They could be on their WhatsApp, they could be watching a video of the Ukraine war, or they could still be trying to find out where's Nandipa from Tanzania, but well done. Llewellyn, a question of culture on my side. It is very easy when we speak of assets in a company to know that a computer and a desk are assets. When we speak of financials, it is also very easy to know what's the revenue of a company. In your experience, Llewellyn, is it easy to understand and just to know what is company culture in your own experience?
Yeah, so I mean, you may be interested to know I'm an actuary by profession. But what drew me to culture is, you know, often people say culture is the soft stuff, the nebulous stuff. How do you get your head around it? And what attracted me, besides believing how important that is that I believe you can track it. You can actually measure it. You can actually get a sense of where we are now and where we need to go. So I've really enjoyed helping organizations measure and understand their culture and what they need to have instead of what they actually have.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Llewellyn. You just mentioned now that you're an actuary, and I nearly wanted to ask you about my policy premiums. How do they calculate them? And also, if I leave my cell phone at a desk at a fortune store in a mall, chances of it being stolen, then I realized, no, this is an HR forum, this is not an actuary, this is not about policies. My other question then, Llewellyn, sitting in this session, hearing you talking about culture, and I work in HR or I run a business, in your mind, where would be the best place to start?
That's a great question. So leaders who are sitting in the more kind of toxic or rigid space want to outsource this to HR. You know, HR understand our culture, and you're responsible for helping us have a good culture. So the important thing there is that at HR, you need to be able to hold up a mirror and bring your leaders on a journey. And ultimately, the CEO, in my mind, is the person who actually owns the culture. And yes, they may have an executive or someone on the exco that they want to allocate the kind of project sponsor to, or the person who must carry some responsibility for initiatives and strategy around culture, etc. But your CEO and your exco team have to own culture if they're serious about wanting to change it or have a healthier culture going forward.
Okay, thanks, Llewellyn. Thanks, Clinton Branders. What is the potential timeline to change a culture? Is it 3 years? Is it 20 years? Yeah. Thanks, Brandon. Clinton, a very good question.
Great question, Brandon. So culture is always a journey, right? We're always trying to get to where we want to be, but we're never quite sure if we're getting there or exceeding. And I've seen some organizations change very quickly. And it's interesting. I think if you're a smaller team, depending on the leader and the leader's openness, you can actually change culture very quickly. I mean, I've seen toxic teams become actually good and great within a year. When it comes to organizations, there's more inertia, there's more momentum, it takes longer, which is why there needs to be an intentional focus on culture on an ongoing basis in bigger organizations. But I would often say, if you're an organization of any reasonable number, 200 plus, this is the 3 to 5 year journey to actually really start shifting the dial in a healthy way.
Thanks, Lou. And I've got another question from Sharif Davis. She wants to know what is the best way to measure. So again, back to that issue of metrics. What is the best way to measure culture? Is it only by survey? Shukran, Sharif. So the question is, what is the best way to measure culture? Is it only through surveys?
So a couple of comments there. I mean, firstly, the survey is only a tool to serve the culture journey. So what surveys are helpful with is they give you a kind of a time in history. What did it look like? What were the issues? What can we celebrate? What's happening at the moment? But really, all of these survey tools, whichever one you look at, and we speak in culture, and some of you are probably even thinking engagement, pulse. I mean, there's so many things that we can use now with employees. The real issue for me is they create an opportunity for dialogue, and it's the dialogue that brings the value. So if you think you're going to manage culture by survey, no chance. If you think the survey can serve you in your culture journey and the dialogues you're going to have, absolutely, 100%. I think it's essential. Smaller organizations, sometimes you can run focus groups and discussions, but remember, if you've got a healthy culture, that's easy. If you've got that toxic and rigid stuff, people aren't going to volunteer that information typically. And that's where survey really helps.
Okay. And then the other question I have, well, it's not in the chat box. Sometimes we hear words like formal culture, informal culture. What's the difference? What does that mean? Formele cultuur and formele cultuur. Is there a difference? What does that mean? And then I'll give over and I'll share another question from Clinton as well. Is there a difference between informal and formal? And what does that mean? And can you please give us examples of an informal culture and a formal culture? Over to you, Llewellyn.
Oh, Samkela, that's a good question, which I've never had before, actually. One thing I can say is any organization of size, you walk into the entrance, you see the values on the wall. There can be a code of behavior or a culture code or whatever. They've got all this stuff on the walls, which is kind of I don't know if that's what you mean by the formal stuff. But actually, if you sit in reception, I always say, let me sit in your reception for 15 minutes and I'll tell you what your culture's like.
Wow.
It's that thing of how things are done around you. That's the true culture. And the problem is you can have a written or a formal thing. This is how we need to live. People quickly experience what is needed for me to fit into this space. And they almost morph into what that looks like. And the danger there is people aren't free to bring their whole selves to work. And that's usually what you want. You don't want to put them in a box and say, only behave like this. You want the full person to contribute. So formal for me would be documentation and stuff, whereas informal is what's actually happening. I don't know if I've answered your question correctly, Sankila.
No, you're spot on. Clinton has asked another question. Does one need to use a third party in terms of measuring culture, or one can do it internally? What is your thought? If measuring culture, should I use a third party, a consulting company, go to Harvard Business School, or can I ask Vodacom to help me, or can I do it internally? Your thoughts?
So the big thing for me is anonymity. So if you want people to be honest and open and you're not sure where they're sitting, having an anonymous way to contribute is really helpful. And then the question is just, if you're running it internally, is that completely feasible and possible? And may well be. Or it might be easier to actually say, hey, Savannah or whoever is running a survey for me, they're completely independent and your responses are hidden from us. And people can get, if there's a toxic type culture or there's a lot of rigidity, they don't trust much. And so even if you tell them it's online, we can't see, they say, yeah, but my computer, my IP address, they get very worried and flustered about what's going on. So it can be very helpful, but it's not essential.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you very much. And just before we close, Llewellyn, when you were responding earlier on, you used these words. You said if I go to your reception area and I sit in front, I will be able to tell you what your culture is like. Help me to understand in this virtual world that we live in, if we invite you as a company, maybe we're sitting here as a BPO or we are a vendor. If we invite you to an online meeting and we keep you in the lobby for the Zoom MS Team meetings, are you still able to learn our culture? It's not play it safe.
I'll tell you that there are a couple of things that happen in virtual settings, and this is different because it's a webinar. But you know, how many people put their screens, their cameras on? What do they talk about? Is it purely, you know, an agenda-driven thing? Everyone's cameras off. You get a quick sense of, wow, there's very little relational stuff here. And you start wondering what's the team cohesion look like, as opposed to a more open space. How many questions get asked? What kind of questions get asked? I mean, there are many indicators of what may be happening in the culture.
Okay, no, thank you very much. And Lou, just for the benefit and to clear any doubts, all the 39 delegates sitting on this call did not put their cameras off because they're going to get into a truck and toast a fuel or anything. Just that they are listening, but it's a bandwidth issue. Just for clarity, our cameras are not off because we're going to enter a truck in South Africa and throw fuel and we're trying to avoid a dash cam. But anyway, thank you very much. It was a good presentation and good feedback. I saw your details as well. Thank you very much, Llewellyn. We're going to try and go back to Tracy Freeman to tell us just high-level feedback on the salary survey. Over to you, Tracy, and welcome.
Thanks very much, Samkelo. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you loud and clear.
So then that was my tech work for the day. All you have to do is reboot and then suddenly it works. So thanks very much, everyone. Yeah, it was a great opportunity just to link in with this forum. And Llewellyn, I just want to say thanks so much for your presentation. One of the big things that's coming through now is really about employee experience, and that obviously ties in hugely from a cultural perspective, but how that is impacting what is core to the global business services in the BPO sector, which is the CX side of things, the customer experience, and just the tie in there. So I have no doubt that everyone found a lot of value in what you had to share. And Samkelo, your question around virtual is as relevant for our sector as well, with so many of our organizations and BPOs having a hybrid or fully virtual setup. And there were a lot of questions recently in a forum around managing that culture for the virtual team. So thank you for that. Then Renee, also thanks very much for the SAYouth.mobi presentation, which ties into what I just wanted to spend 1 minute just outlining. It's more sort of a newsworthy, letting everybody know what's happening. But many of you, or your organizations and others that are not on this call, are often reaching out to BPESA to ask what the latest salaries are. And the last salary survey that we did, we had a bit of a snapshot. It was around about 2021. And we know that there's been a shift recently. So just to let everybody know that we will be reaching out to you. You can expect engagement from our research partner, Genesis and Genesis GBS, just asking about salaries. But over and above that, I will also be reaching out directly to a couple of our BPOs and contact centers, just to make sure that we have covered the breadth and scope of the different designations that we need to be considering, both entry level, someone who's been in their position for sort of 2-3 years, and then, you know, your more mature individual who may have been there sort of 5 years and beyond. So it was really just an opportunity that Samkelo gave me on this forum to let you know we are going to be doing this. The research will probably take 8 to 12 weeks, but the call out is when the queries come through, please do take the time to respond and fill out the information. The more info we get from you as industry, the more info we have to actually assimilate and then share back with yourselves, and then obviously the international community that asks a lot as well. So let me just leave it there, and if there are any queries, you can just connect with myself directly. And probably, sorry, last thing I will throw in, just because I've got the mic and it's working, we hopefully you've all seen that we have launched our annual industry awards. So that's all on the website already. The actual platform for submitting your awards will open up on the 1st of August. But next week on the 27th, I think that's Thursday, we will be hosting a session, and we'll be sending the invite out this week, We'll be hosting a session just to walk you through the platform. Anyone that entered last year, it is a very similar platform, so it shouldn't be too new and scary, but just if there are any queries. And we're hoping we're going to have a record number of entries coming through this year with all the phenomenal things that everybody's doing and the amazing people that we have in our sector. So thanks very much for the opportunity, Samkelo. Appreciate it. And best of luck with the rest of the session.
You are a start, Tracy, and well done. So it's a salary survey, and also it's the awards that are coming up. Time now is exactly 12 minutes past 11. We're doing very well on time. Just a high-level summary of what we've done so far. We began with the SAYouth platform. We did a practical demo in terms of how to load candidates, how to look for candidates, and also how to manage applications. And then we moved over to organizational culture. Why it's important, what to look for culture, and in terms of endearing or a good culture, the role of leaders in culture, and whether we can measure culture internally or externally. It was a very rich discussion done by Llewellyn. We're now going to move over to my dear friend, John Botha. But before we move, we always speak about work-life balance. So I'm going to give all of us a 3-minute, strictly 3-minute comfort break for you to put on the kettle, to take the chicken or the mutton out of the fridge, to process the payment, and as always, to quickly respond to the email to the CEO or the director, say that you are busy. We'll reconvene exactly at 11:15. 2-minute comfort break to stretch, to put on the kettle, take out the meat from the fridge, and always respond to the email from the boss to say you are busy. We shall start promptly at 11:15 with John. Thank you, colleagues. Okay, welcome back, everyone. It's exactly 11:15. As you can see, we have nothing called African time. I would suggest Janine, Tamara, Evelyn, Cheryl, Sharif, Shoban, Jessica, Zelda, and my dear sister Stacy and Kathy. I suggest that we start. It gives me great pleasure to introduce John Botha from a company called Global Business Solutions. I know that when you hear the surname Botha, you start to think about so many things. Just a disclaimer, this is not Beck Botha. 2, that is niet die groot crocodile. This is John Botha from Global Business Solutions. He would like to share with us the Amendment Employment Equity Act, the challenges with that act, but also what I like about John, he did mention that he's going to get very practical and guide us in terms of what does the act mean, what do companies have to do in as far as the Employment Equity Act is concerned. So this is not Rastellende Axi, he's helping all our members. Special welcome, John. Hopefully when I meet you one day, I see that you also love horses. I might get a horse ride to Egypt when I see you. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Samkelo. Good afternoon, or rather good morning still. It feels like afternoon. I'm going to be covering the Employment Equity Amendment Bill and really just trying to share with you some of the thought leadership, some of the practical steps that you need to consider, and really to internalize it. I'm going to move pretty robustly. Some of the aspects I'm going to touch on are culture-related issues, as Llewellyn was speaking to earlier. One thing I can guarantee you, colleagues, is that if your organizational culture is not intact, you will not achieve your transformation targets over the next 5 years. But more of that later on, and Samkelo to you and the colleagues, thanks for this opportunity. The slides will be made available to you, so please rather use the opportunity to identify any specific areas of clarity, and we'll open for Q&A after the session. The first thing I want to talk about, colleagues, relates largely to the issue of culture. In our organization, when we train on emotional intelligence, we talk about a formula that is connection times task equals results. And it's the connection aspect that is so critically important, because employment equity can be approached as a task, and there are task-related elements. But unless you connect with your stakeholders and build deep relationships and trusting relationships, the tasks on their own are not going to cut it. So when we look at employment equity, what we find is the existing environment in which we are implementing employment equity is a highly polarized environment. In other words, people are sitting on extremes. There's division, there's disunity. This research was done by the Edelman Foundation earlier this year, and you'll see South Africa ranks as one of the most disruptive and polarized geographies in the world. By polarization, they measure it firstly on to what extent is your country divided, and secondly, what are the prospects of overcoming those divisions and having harmony. Now, if this is the environment in which we are implementing employment equity, which naturally lends itself to polarization, organizations are either going to be casualties or they're going to be beneficiaries of this particular change. Because conflict can be healthy, but if the environment is one of distrust, if the environment is one, as Llewellyn was saying, that is toxic, where leaders would rather avoid these discussions and avoid this and hope that it disappears, those environments are going to result in unhealthy conflict and increased polarization. Now, employment equity definitely has got to do with data, especially since the Minister of Employment and Labour has legislated and is busy legislating those ministerial targets for race, gender, and disability over the next 5 years. But data can at least be more easily resolved because, you know, a calculation yields a result and it's either right or it's wrong. So you might not like the answer, but it is the answer nonetheless. Employment equity also involves processes, and processes include awareness creation, nomination of people onto committees, the functioning of the committee, the planning process, and the reporting process. And the processes are very prescribed in law. So again, conflict around process should not be a major issue. The big conflict that I'm picking up is around value systems. There are so many disparate views on this amendment bill, and where there's a low level of emotional intelligence and people are incapable of empathizing and people are incapable of listening with empathy and rather trying to understand, it is in that environment that toxicity and unhealthy conflict arises. And quite honestly, colleagues, my personal view is that organizations need to first establish a foundation of trust, but more about that later on. In addition to this very polarized environment, we've got a disruptive environment. Globally, the World Economic Forum has identified these 10 disruptors as the most pertinent and probable disruptors that organizations globally will face. Now, you can read through this on your own, but most of these have already manifested. And the Employment Equity Amendment Act is one of another raft of to-do items that organizations need to grapple with. Organizations have grappled with COVID-19. If you look at infectious diseases, organizations are grappling with the whole issue of poverty and unemployment and inequality. Organizations are grappling with cyber attacks, and every week we see in South Africa organizations being crippled by virtue of being held to ransom. Organizations have got challenges with inequality and with social cohesion. So, colleagues, employment equity comes at a time in the life of an organization and leaders in an organization that is not comfortable. This is not going to be a comfortable process, but organizations can choose to approach it as an opportunity for differentiation. The reason I'm talking about discomfort is all of this change that we're going through, technological change. We see it literally took 5 days for 1 million people to subscribe to ChatGPT, whereas it took 3.5 years for 1 million people to subscribe to Netflix. And this rate of change, this shark fin curve, is what is creating a lot of the chaos in organizations, because managers that were pretty good managers historically are now being stretched. They're being stretched to become leaders, but to be a leader, you've got to take care of the people that are in your charge, whereas managers take charge. So the average manager is used to taking charge of their staff and issuing instructions, but the average manager is not a leader and hasn't been capacitated as leaders because they now also need to take care. And as Llewellyn said, taking care of your people is a sacrificial act. It's an act that puts their interests at least on an equal footing to yours to get a win-win. But unfortunately, managers have been promoted because they're good at their jobs. They haven't been capacitated to take care of the people. Now, the net effect of all of this change, colleagues, is we see neuropsychiatric disorders being one of the most prevalent disorders in a workforce. Our emotions are under such pressure that from a neuropsychiatric point of view, our employees, our leaders, our managers are filled with anxiety, depression, attention deficit disorders, and the like. So let's add the Employment Equity Amendment Act to this equation. We see the Kubler-Ross change curve applies to any form of deep change. And the Employment Equity Act is deep change because it affects the entire workforce planning aspect of a business. So any deep change, whether it's technology, whether it's the Employment Equity Act, whether it is a new restructuring of your business, is met by shock as a starting point. And we've seen with the Employment Equity Amendment Act, political parties like the DA, trade unions like Solidarity, and other stakeholders coming into this mix with shock and saying this is not going to happen. This is unacceptable, and they will challenge it. Then it goes into denial. So many people were still hoping that the Solidarity referral to the International Labour Organization would derail this new Employment Equity Amendment Act. They were in denial. They were looking for evidence that it wouldn't happen. Of course, we see government and Solidarity striking a settlement. And quite frankly, that settlement means nothing. It changes nothing. because the settlement wording already reiterates what is in law. So anyone who tells you the solidarity agreement's going to change anything is smoking a bit of cannabis. Then we have frustration, and what I'm seeing in corporate South Africa now is the realization, especially among executives, that these ministerial targets are here and they're going to stay. And now they've got to revisit their entire workforce plan, workforce model, and employment lifecycle management. And they're frustrated because they've just dealt with POPI, they've just dealt with cybercrimes, they've just dealt with COVID-19, they are dealing with technological change, etc., etc., and now this as well. And then we also read the ARTO legislation, Samkelo, is also constitutional. So we are very soon going to have demerit points and summonses and fines and what have you. So corporate South Africa are frustrated, they're fatigued, unless they have resilience, unless they are adaptable, unless they say, here is an opportunity to differentiate in the context of the people that are most important to us, and that's our human beings, our people that work for us. The next step is depression. And I can assure you that many organizations are saying, well, you know what, it's got to be done. I've just got to take a day at a time. And then they start experimenting and they start making sense of this. And slowly but surely, they emerge on the other side. The sad reality, colleagues, is the duration of this change and the depth of the disruption is directly proportionate to smart trust, the character levels and the competencies that Llewellyn was speaking to. So in companies, we're going to have to be very self-aware. We're going to have to do EQ training because managers are going to be approached by staff. Some staff members are going to say, we disagree with this, we don't agree with this because of it undermining my career path. Other people are going to come and say, well, what is this stuff about harassment? I'm not going to change the way I speak. I'm not going to stop making jokes. So you got on the one extreme insensitive people in organizations who are emotionally blind. So employees are going to be arriving at work and they're going to feel maybe that their prospects of career pathing and promotion are eroded, or maybe they're being harassed. And then they're going to meet with an emotionally blind manager who says, I'm not interested in your problems. When you're at work, you've got to focus on the task. And then on the other extreme, you've got hypersensitive people, people who effectively are going to basically, be extremely, extremely sensitive to these matters. So, colleagues, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but when it comes to employment equity, if you want to be a high-performing organization in the context of employment equity, there's going to be a time for leaders to be nurturing. In other words, for them to be kind and caring and to engage and communicate effectively. But there will also be the time where the leaders are going to have to be critical. They're going to have to say, listen, we are going to do this now. This is the target. These are the plans. And we're going to have to take charge of the situation. And it's the ability of leaders to intermediate between being nurturing and critical that drives high-performance teams. We cannot pussyfoot around the Employment Equity Amendment Act. We cannot just be nurturing and loving and don't worry, it's not going to be an issue, and all hold hands and sing Kumbaya, because nothing's going to happen. Everyone's going to sort of be very comfortable, but not a huge amount of traction. But on the other hand, we can't be critical all the time and say, these are imposed on us, we're going to have to do it whether we like it or not, so just get going, and this is the task. If you're overly critical, people are going to be fearful and silent because they're just going to internalize it. So the bottom line, colleagues, is we need to ensure that our organizations are functional. We need high levels of trust, because high levels of trust are evidenced in the the openness to being vulnerable. So when we ask employees to disclose their disabilities, when we ask employees to participate in harassment risk assessments, they must feel that the levels of trust are sufficient for them to disclose and to be vulnerable. Because in the absence of trust, people will be fearful and silent. And that's why in many companies, people are not disclosing their disabilities, especially their psychological, intellectual, or mental disabilities, because they are fearful of repercussions and victimization. Where there's an absence of trust, there's unhealthy conflict or no conflict at all, which means people are not engaging, not collaborating, and the outcome is not what it should be from an innovative and creativity point of view. If you haven't then participated in the employment equity process and given your views and been engaged, well, then there's a lack of commitment, which means I'm not being held accountable, and ultimately the results don't follow. Now, colleagues, it's been an incredibly busy year from a labor law point of view, and I'm not going to go through all of these laws because it will take the next hour. But what I want to point out is the Employment Equity Amendment Act has already been assented to by the President. We are just waiting for him to sign it into law. So it's been signed off, but it hasn't yet been promulgated. And we are being told in the background, the Minister of Employment and Labor is speaking to the President on a regular basis, and the promulgation of the Employment Equity Act is imminent. Many people say, John, why did the minister have to go and set targets for organizations? Why could we not continue setting our own targets? Well, colleagues, if we purely look at it from a data point of view, organizations have been dragging their feet. If you look at the last 20 years, just as an example, at top management level, African representation has increased only from 6 to 17% at top management. That is an 11% increase over 20 years. And if your maths is as good as mine is not, you'll see we've only improved and progressed at 0.5% per annum. If we look at women at top management, very much the same, 13% over 20 years, which is less than 1% a year. And this is why government are saying it's not that we haven't made progress, but the progress has not been reasonable as is required by law. And therefore the minister says, right, I will set for you targets to be achieved by 2028. The minister says, what you've been doing is not working. The fact that you've been left to your own devices, that you've been setting targets, you have not set targets that are sufficient. And effectively, the minister is saying your employment equity plans, your culture, your strategies, and your plans are missing the point. Somewhere along the line, something's wrong. Now, I must tell you, colleagues, I don't believe that companies are not achieving their targets because of a lack of task. Every company knows by now they need a committee. They need to meet quarterly. They need a senior manager responsible for employment equity. They need a plan and they need to report. Every company knows what the task is. And we've got these beautifully designed plans. I mean, you can go to any company on this call and they'll show you their employment equity policy and their transformation strategy and the employment equity plan. And it looks absolutely beautiful on the walls and on the laptops and on their websites. But just like this walkway looks so beautiful, the user experience is terrible. So effectively, these plans are not fit for purpose. They are not changing behavior. They are merely plans. And when Llewellyn was talking about culture, I couldn't help but think to myself that the culture of an organization is demonstrated in the behaviors. The behaviors of these people in organizations drive the results. So if the culture is not one of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, the line managers that are recruiting, selecting, training, promoting, and succession planning are not going to change their behavior. And as a result, the ultimate objectives are not going to be achieved. And my personal view, colleagues, is that plans have been poorly designed because, firstly, the tasks are not very clear and they are not being appropriated as KPAs and KPIs to line managers. And secondly, the culture has been lacking significantly. And I'm very pleased that the harassment code and other laws such as PAPUDA and the Cybercrimes Act, they are now legislating against toxic environments at work. They're saying we will not tolerate toxic leaders that harass their staff and that undermine the principles of transformation. Colleagues, 94% of organizations have been found wanting in terms of the Employment Equity Act. So when they're inspected, 94% of companies have failed the DG reviews. Sometimes it's a simple matter. They haven't appointed a senior manager responsible for employment equity in writing. Other times they haven't met at least on a quarterly basis. Other times they don't have the proper representation on their committees. More importantly, their Section 19, their affirmative action plans, the employment equity plans and their analyses do not properly represent the realities at the workplace, and then their plans are not making reasonable progress. Now, what we see happening is that the Department of Employment and Labour are saying, listen, we've had enough. We're now going to come to you and we're going to look at your plan and do a review. And if we see you're not committing and implementing your own plan, well, then we're going to take you to the Labour Court. Now, this was published in the public domain, and effectively, we see some of the big banks being hauled to the Labour Court. Why? If you look at the right-hand side where my cursor is, it says that they are not implementing their own affirmative action measures. So when they've got deficiencies of a race or gender subgroup, in their plans, they say they're going to give preferential treatment. But when the vacancy becomes available, they are not appointing the targeted designated person. So Department of Labour are monitoring this and then saying to them eventually, you know what, we've had it now, we're going to take you to the Labour Court. Now, I don't need to remind you that the fines attributable to breaches of the Employment Equity Act started 1.5 million rand or 2% of your annual turnover, whichever is the greater. Now, some of these banks' annual turnover in South Africa is 20 billion rand and more. Imagine being fined 2% of 20 billion rand. That would be a 400 million rand fine. Forget about the negative impact it has on staff motivation and productivity and retention, but the fine itself is a problem. So I've just wanted to sketch the background, colleagues, to create a bit of a burning platform. Now what we do is let's get stuck into the Employment Equity Amendment Act. And in this letter issued by the Department of Employment and Labour on the 15th of May, we see the Department of Employment and Labour saying the following. They say in paragraph 2 that employers are reminded to start conducting an analysis in terms of Section 19 that talks about analysis of their workforce profile and an analysis of their employment practices and policies, and preparing an employment equity plan in terms of Section 20 in order to align to the proposed numerical targets. So the minister's targets have been published, and they're saying, get off your blessed assurance, start now. For in case you didn't catch it in that paragraph, Mtswaki says in the next paragraph, the early preparation process will assist a great deal in ensuring that upon the final publication of the EE targets, that designated employers are ready to rock and roll. Colleagues, we are past midway through July. We then have August, and the following month in September, the employment equity reporting season already starts. So you will have from 1st of September to 15th of January next year to submit your employment equity report. But your report is the back end of the whole process. And on the screen, I'm not going to go through this, but here you see the process that's got to be followed prior to you reporting to the Department of Employment and Labor. So you literally need to start getting your house in order. So when we look at it from a timeline point of view, we can see here that the Act has gone through National Assembly, through the National Council of Provinces. The President assented to the Act on the 12th of April. Department of Labor released a press statement on the 9th of May saying 1 December, that is D-Day. We are implementing from 1 December the new reporting season. Solidarity then went and filed papers with the DA and other civic organizations. Solidarity, of course, have now reached agreement with government and settled that dispute. So yes, there'll be other disputes, but there is nothing right now that remotely will suspend the implementation of this dispensation. We then have 18 sectoral targets, and then, colleagues, we have got the 1st of September looming. So with that in mind, I want to just say to you that, practically speaking, the end of this year is your baseline reporting year. In other words, when you submit your employment equity report this year, you have to capture your targets for the next 5 years. The 5th year, of course, is cast in stone. You don't have discretion. The 5th year is, colleagues, the ministerial target year. So I'm going to just skip ahead and quickly talk about the ministerial targets. So you'll remember the Government Gazette published on the 12th of May said there are 18 sectors. And of course, in your environment, some of you will fall under financial and insurance activities, and others under ICT or business services or administrative and support activities. But the bottom line is, whichever of these you fall under, if it's administrative and support activities, the Minister of Employment and Labor has now set African, Colored, Indian targets at top management, senior management, middle and junior management. And these targets, colleagues, are the targets that you will capture in your employment equity report to the Department of Employment and Labor for 2028, the one in yellow. You, however, are free to set your own targets in the intervening period between now and 2028. But you will have to capture them this year when you submit your employment equity reports. So I'm just saying to you that this year is really important because your occupational levels, your target setting, your strategies, and your plans for the next 5 years have to be finalized now. The reason being that all the past is forgotten. Come the 1st of September, all your existing plans, all your existing policies in terms of this and targets fall away. You now start a brand new 5-year period, and you need to make sure that you've thought it through clearly, because if you don't meet your own targets, well, then you're going to be challenged and you can face significant penalties, which we'll look at just now. So let's talk quickly about this matter of the big changes to the Employment Equity Act. Colleagues, the first big change is that they've removed the annual turnover threshold in terms of a designated employer. In other words, if you employ more than 50 staff, you are a designated employer that has to comply with Chapter 3, which I'm covering now. If you employ less than 50 staff, well, then you're not a designated employer and you don't need to comply with Chapter 3. The second big amendment, and I want to touch on this very quickly, but it's important, is the definition of people with disabilities. Because, colleagues, you'll remember, the target for people with disabilities across all sectors under employment equity is 2% of your workforce. So in order to achieve that, you need to run campaigns in your organizations between now and when you report to get people to disclose their disabilities. So disabilities have got 3 components, and all 3 have to be present before you are classified as a person with disabilities. The first one is that it's got to be long-term or recurring, more than 12 months and repetitive. That's step 1. Step 2, it has to be physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments. Now, the underlined parts are the new additions. So previously it just said physical or mental, but they've included intellectual and sensory. And I think for me, a large part of that inclusion has got to do with the invisible conditions like depression, like anxiety disorders that are so prevalent. And sensory impairment is like sight, feeling, touch, smelling, spatial awareness. But the third component is the one that is the most important, and it says, notwithstanding these conditions, they must limit your prospects of entry into or advancement in employment. And in fact, they use the word substantially limit. Now, I touched on this earlier. The EEA1 form is being revamped, and you're going to have to reissue the EEA1 forms so that people can disclose their race, their gender, but also whether or not they consider themselves to be people with disabilities. Bearing in mind, colleagues, bearing in mind that it is a voluntary disclosure of disabilities. There is no legal obligation on employees to disclose their disabilities. Of course, you also then need to, in terms of Section 16, have your Employment Equity Committee that is established. And this committee must represent all occupational levels, race, gender, disability, as well as trade union and non-trade union individuals. So if your committee has been faulty, if it's been dysfunctional, you now need to re-establish that committee and make sure you've got the proper representatives representing all interest groups, and that committee is trained and capacitated on these amendments. By far, colleagues, the biggest challenge in this particular framework of the amendments is this issue of numerical targets. Now, Section 15, capital A, clearly says that the Minister of Employment and Labour, if you look at subsection 2, can set numerical targets for any national economic sector identified. So these targets, colleagues, mean, and I've taken you there, I'm going to go back there very quickly. Let's say that this is your sector, you fall under administrative and support activities. You, by 2028, these are the targets that will be put in that column. 26.1% African male, 17.4% African female, colored, Indian, etc. at top management level. Senior management, ultimately 65% black representation. Middle management, 85%. Junior and skilled, 91%. So these targets, colleagues, these targets have been set in terms of Section 15, capital A. Now, what we are doing with our clients is we are running the numbers. Here is an example of a company that has got a numerical analysis. Now, in this company, you'll see at, for example, middle management level, and this is purely for illustrative purposes, we've worked out that by 2028, this company needs 30 additional African males at middle management level. They currently have 14. By 2028, they need 30. African females, by 2028, an additional 13.63, or if you round it up, 14. Then colored male is the next, the third highest in the pecking order, and then colored female. Now you can see, even at junior management level, they'll need 39 additional African females, 35 additional African males. So organizations need to run the numbers. They need the data to get a sense of what the gap is between where they are now and where they need to be by 2028. Because clearly the next step is then to determine how you will achieve those targets. So we saw Harambee present earlier. So at the front end, companies are going to focus on internships, learnerships, apprenticeships, bursary schemes, and other things like Harambee, Yes for Youth, and other accelerators that can assist you in the front end with talent of the right race and gender mix coming in. Once in the organization, leadership development, management development, career planning, succession planning is critical, because you are going to have to set your targets for each year over the next 5 years. So you're going to have to say, of these 30 African males in 2024, 2025, 26, and 27, we will do the following and make the following progress. And if you don't meet those targets, you will be called to answer for that. Now, some people say to me, right, John, so what is the repercussion of organizations not meeting their targets annually? Because remember, even though the ministerial targets are scheduled and have to be met by 2028, you set your own targets in the first 4 years. And if you miss your own targets, then you will have to answer. So what are the consequences of not getting a certificate of compliance? Well, the first one is you will be excluded from public sector tenders. Government will automatically exclude you. Now, some people say, John, that's cool because, you know, we don't deal with public sector. Well, on the bottom right, you'll see there's also possible exclusion from the private sector. In other words, if you look at organizations that are your clients, whether it be banks, manufacturing businesses, retail businesses, any of your clients, they will also probably voluntarily include a compliance certificate as part of their procurement protocols. So chances are you're also going to miss out on private sector tenders. Then you've got potential exclusion from BE points under management control. So those 19 points under management control may not be accessible for you in the future if you don't have a certificate. Just like skills development. Your skills development element can only be verified if you've got proof of your WSP ATR submission. And the Employment Equity Commission are talking to the BE Commission, and they are looking at amending the codes to require a certificate as a prerequisite for management control. And then, of course, potential litigation and fines of 2 to 10% of annual turnover. So you might say, but John, when will you not get a certificate of compliance? Well, the first criteria is you must meet your numerical targets. So every year when you capture your report, it will look, the system will look at it, and the inbuilt formulas and macros and artificial intelligence will say whether or not your company is achieving its targets. If it's not achieving its targets, colleagues, you will be asked to give a justifiable reason. Now, there are only 7 justifiable reasons. So if you haven't met your targets, the first reason you could attach it to is you didn't have recruitment opportunities. The second one is you didn't have promotion opportunities. So you will have to lead evidence in that regard. No one left, therefore we didn't recruit. The third justification could be that you don't have people from designated groups with sufficient skills and experience and qualifications. But many companies hide behind that. So you're not just going to be able to say we couldn't find the skills, you're going to have to prove that you looked at what is called a suitably qualified person. You're going to have to prove that amongst the applicants, there was no one who could acquire the skills within a reasonable time. You could also lead evidence that you had a merger, an acquisition, a transfer of a business which impacted your numbers, or finally, that you had business interruptions like COVID-19, social unrest, cyber attacks, and whatever the case may be. So colleagues, very, very important that you will not get a certificate of compliance in the event that you don't meet your targets and you cannot justify the reason for that. The second one, very important, and this which is what talks to toxic cultures. If you lose a CCMA or a labor court matter around unfair discrimination, including harassment, you will not get a certificate of compliance as a company if you cannot prove that you've taken reasonable steps to prevent harassment and discrimination in your company. So you will have to stand in court and say to the judge, we've got a policy on employment equity and harassment. We've got a procedure. We've got a grievance procedure. We've got a disciplinary procedure. We did awareness creation. We did a risk assessment. We've done all of this, oh judge. And John still went and harassed his colleague. Only then your company will not be vicariously liable. But if your company cannot lead evidence that it's done what is reasonably possible, you will face no certificate and potential litigation. Obviously, if you fail a DG review, or you don't pay the national minimum wage, or you don't submit a report to the Department of Employment and Labour, then you would also face no certificate. So colleagues, I just want to emphasize the importance of organizations in respect of Section 15, capital A. You will have to set targets. You need to do it quickly, and you need to do it in terms of consultation with your committees, putting your plans and other strategies together. So these are the 18 sectors. Of course, by now you would have identified which sector you fall within. And of course, each sector, as I say, have got targets. And it's your ability to have a very strategic and deliberate approach to achieving these targets that will either make or break you over the next 5 years. So effectively, if you look at this...
Thanks, John. I'm just conscious of time.
Right, okay. So off the back of that, Samkelo and colleagues, the last thing I want to touch on is the importance of doing a harassment risk assessment. In the Code of Practice on Harassment, section, or rather 8.8.1 says employers are under an obligation in terms of section 60 of the Employment Equity Act to take proactive steps to prevent all forms of harassment, which includes an assessment of the risk of harassment. So what I want to conclude with today is just to say to you, remember, if your company is found guilty of unfair discrimination, which includes harassment, your company can be taken to the Labour Court and also lose their certificate of compliance or not get one. So it's highly recommended that organizations do a risk assessment and a survey, because certain types of organizations lend themselves to certain types of harassment. And of course, harassment, as you'd see in the codes of practice, includes things like joking at someone's expense, using abusive language, condescending eye contact, or rolling your eyes at people. So this is where behavioral and self-regulation training comes very much into the mix. So colleagues, there's a lot to be said. I think Samkelo, in summary, the colleagues will get the slides, but for me, it's about doing the numbers, seeing what the gap is between now and 2028, putting strategies together and plans, consulting with your stakeholders, and of course, then implementing your plans. And then complementing that with the EQ training and leadership training, because management set the tone in these environments. Thanks a lot.
No, thank you very much, John. That was very helpful. I'm conscious that some people have already left. You did indicate your contact details. You are coming from Global Business Solutions. Colleagues, I'm conscious of time. Thank you very much for attending this HR forum. There will also be other HR forums coming in as we go ahead. So thank you for your attendance. Renee, Llewellyn, and my brother, John Botha, all of you were stars. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And thank you to everyone who attended. Cheers, colleagues. Bye.